Finally, a version of Leif that is permanent. Civilian Leif is a permanent 5-star light sword unit, who has an interesting name for a variant of Leif. If he is really meant to be disguised as a civilian, then he sure has a good fashion sense, with the amount of belts on his outfit alone comparable to Sol Bad Guy from Guilty Gear. His outfit also serves to confuse his intended element, as the prominent red colors had made me thought that civilian Leif belongs to the flame element. That aside, civilian Leif certainly has some peculiarities in his kit. For starters, he is another unit that can inflict 2 types of damage over time afflictions, which in his case is paralysis and bleeding, being the first light unit that can inflict bleeding easily, not counting Halloween Edward, as his bleeding is gated behind an HP requirement. Interestingly, while making this video, I wasn't able to find many videos that showcase civilian Leif in battle. Enough of the intro, let's check out his full kit in greater detail. His first skill, Gallant Sparrow, costs 3150 SP. It deals 1783% damage to frontal enemies, and performs 10% adaptive suppression towards hit enemies, and inflicts paralysis. This skill features the relatively new adaptive suppression mechanic that was first introduced on Yucca to Clear. It's basically the exact same strength debuff mechanic, but with certain requirements. This debuff will only work if the hit enemies use attacks that either has no element or an element that Leif has an advantage against. Basically, if Leif is attacking a shadow enemy, this debuff will pretty much work. For a strength debuff skill that can also inflict damage over time, the SP cost is relatively low, not to mention decent damage modifiers when compared with the cost. Overall, this skill is a good skill with 3 distinct functions. His second skill, Unfettered Loyalty, costs 6880 SP. It deals 2128% damage, lowers light resistance of enemies by 5% for 10 seconds, and grants Leif a strength amp, with a maximum amp level of 2. This skill has okay damage for the cost, but works more as a buffing and debuffing skill. Buffing strength with strength amp, while debuffing enemy light resistance. It's also a skill that is perfect for a Dominion battle, with strength amp enduring Curse of Nihility, and light resistance debuff allowing for increased damage received by the enemy. Overall, this is also a good skill that mainly serves as a booster to overall team damage. Civilian Leif has the typical 15% Dragon Haste Co ability for sword units. For his Chain Co ability, he has a shielding ability that procs when HP is below 40%. It can nullify damage up to 50% of maximum HP. It is a saving grace when dealing with enemies with high burst attacks, increasing overall team survivability. For his standard abilities, let's get his poison resistance out of the way first. Resistance to poison over curse is good to ensure that poison will not drain your HP, and even when cursed, it's not like Leif will become straight up useless and defenseless. His 20% debuff skill time is a perfect complement to his debuff heavy kit. With this, he can extend the duration of the 3 debuffs that he can inflict upon enemies, which are Strength, Defense, and Bleed. Oh wait, it doesn't affect bleed duration, as the bleed doesn't originate from a skill. Still, extending the strength and defense debuffs onto enemies is a good ability for Leif to have. Lastly, his exclusive ability, Pledge of Justice. This ability grants Leif a unique Force Strike that deals 2 hits instead of 1 from typical Force Strikes. The second hit of this Force Strike can inflict bleeding onto enemies. Also, he receives a 20% Force Strike damage increase with this ability, and is immune to knockback while charging and executing his Force Strikes. The damage mods of this Force Strike is shown at the table below. Basically, the first strike is essentially the same as the typical sword variant, but the second strike has higher damage modifiers, greater SP gain, inflicts bleed, and significantly lowered overdrive modifiers. A unique feature of this skill is that there is no cooldown on the bleeding ability, which means that he can use at least 3 of his Force Strikes consecutively to get the highest stack of bleeding. Since bleeding is a debuff and not grouped together with typical damage over time afflictions, enemies cannot build resistance to it over time unless having a special ability to do so. It's a great ability and one that makes Leif sufficiently unique from other sword users. The roles that civilian Leif play in a team are main DPS and debuff support. He has sufficient damage output and impressive debuff capabilities to warrant for these two roles. You can build him as a hybrid of a support/DPS build, with the inclusion of bleeding punisher abilities, as Leif can proc bleeding relatively quickly. Additional force strike damage is applicable too, as Leif has higher base force strike damage, thanks to his unique force strike. For his dragon of choice, I personally want a dragon with more offensive capabilities for Leif. Reborn Gene is the best dragon available for him, with incredibly high damage modifiers. Thor is a decent option for him, to increase the damage of both of his skills. Summer Cat Sith is a surprisingly great option for Leif, if and only if the team has Summer Shell, or the capability to inflict flash burn and grant defense amps. Other offense style like dragons are usable, depending on what imprints are used on Leif. For team setup, I'd recommend another debuff support unit as well as an affliction support unit. As of now, Shawujing is another excellent debuff support unit. In terms of an affliction support unit, the only applicable candidate for an extended battle is Summer Shell. If Leif is to be the main source of damage output, I would also recommend Lucretia, with her energy and inspiration. This is applicable under the condition that the enemy will not use Curse of Nihility. The same can be said for light buffing units, with the exception of Isaac, who is essentially immune to Curse of Nihility. For Wimprints, if I were to actually have him, I would enhance his offensive abilities, accompanied by some skill haste from one 4-star print, and one Dominion print. For affinity bonuses, I would go for additional force strike damage, but having skill haste bonuses is fine for Leif too. Civilian Leif scores high in my book, both in his kit and design. He has good damage output, accompanied by excellent debuffing capabilities, to aid the team in dealing additional damage, or receiving less damage. Him being the only light unit that can consistently inflict bleeding also make him a very welcomed member in a light team. His weakness in my opinion, is a low potency in his debuff skills. Despite having a longer debuff duration, it limits the amount of damage increase the team can deal to enemies, and also the amount of damage decrease of enemies. But overall, Civilian Leif is a great addition into any roster, achieving a good balance between DPS and debuff support. Now go out there and escape the city of Grams, while bringing along Cecile, and beating the shit out of Herald. That's all from me. Moga out.